The utterances of the native people of Guam may sound familiar to the people from Hawaii. Guam's history with the U.S., particularly the U.S. military, is complicated. After remaining loyal to the U.S. through a brutal occupation by the Japanese during World War II, many Chamorros believe they were stripped of their ancestral lands, and today they live with the threat of nuclear destruction. Rescued or Reoccupied, tonight's live broadcast and live stream of Insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Daryl Huff from Hawaii News Now. Guam, a U.S. possession since 1898, has recently been a target of North Korea's nuclear threats. With its proximity to Asia, this island, about the size of Chicago with a population of about 160,000 people, plays an increasingly significant role in U.S. military operations. There are currently 6,000 to 7,000 military personnel stationed at American naval and Air Force bases, with plans to transfer 5,000 Marines there from Okinawa by 2022. Serving in the U.S. military is a family tradition for many Guamanians, and the military presence supports the island's economy. But critics complain about the separation of military and civilian school systems, land seizures, military allowances that push up housing costs, environmental issues, and restricted access to ancestral lands. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email, call, or tweet your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guests. Carl Baker is the Executive Director of Pacific Forum Center for Strategic and International Studies. He served as an officer for the UN Military Armistice Commission, an intelligence analyst for U.S. Forces Korea, and in a variety of military staff assignments in Japan, the Philippines, and Guam. Dr. Craig Santos Perez is a native Chamorro who has also lived in California and Hawaii for 20 years. He's an activist involved in decolonization, demilitarization, and environmental justice movements for many years. Dr. Perez is currently an associate professor in the English department at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Esther Kia'aina currently serves as the executive director of the Pacific Basin Development Council. She coordinated federal policy on Guam when she was Department of the Interior's Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs, insular areas under President Obama. Retired Lieutenant General Jeffrey Remington's last assignment during his 35-year career with the U.S. Air Force was as Deputy Commander for the United Nations Command Korea, Deputy Commander of U.S. Forces Korea, and Commander, 7th Air Force. He is currently the Vice President for Government Programs for Northrop Grumman Corporation, a security firm. Now, immediately following tonight's Insights, PBS Hawaii Presents will bring you War for Guam, a documentary that focuses on issues with the U.S. military some of Guam's Chamorro people struggle with today. Now, let me start off with Craig Santos Perez. What is the sense? What is Guam about? What's it like being from Guam? What's it like living on Guam?
Well, it's quite similar to Hawaii. Guam is, the size of Kauai, but a larger population. Growing up as a native Chamorro, we have cultural values that are similar to other Pacific Islanders, and growing up in Guam is also to grow up in one of the most militarized places in the world, where every aspect of our life, our culture, society, economics is impacted in one way or another by the military. Of course, it's a very complicated relationship as well, because so many of my people do serve in the military, including many of my own family members. And so discussions about militarization can become complicated, but so important in these times that we're living today.
Esther Kia'aina, in addition to your role with the U.S. Department of the Interior, you were born on Guam.
That's correct, the U.S. Naval Hospital. My father was a civilian working for the U.S. Navy, and he did that until he retired. So Guam was a wonderful place to be raised in, and our family and we saw shortly after the lifting of restrictions on air travel for civilian aircraft and tourism, we were able to witness the evolution of economic development on the island, which of course included a large military presence. And because my father was a civilian working at the naval base, our family was a direct beneficiary of the impact of DoD's presence on Guam.
Now, Carl Baker, you spent some time living on Guam as well.
I did in the mid-1990s with the Air Force.
And so what was it like for an Air Force family over there?
Well, we moved to Guam from Alabama, so we thought it was a pretty good move because I had spent most of my career in Asia, and so Guam was an opportunity to get back toward Asia. But I thought it was going to be like Hawaii, but we found out it's a lot hotter and it's a lot smaller. And so I think that was sort of the culture shock to me was really how confined you are on Guam and how big the military presence is in that.
How did it feel, though, to be on the base? Did you live on the base, or how does it work? Because most people live on base?
But, yeah, most people live on base, especially the families. And so you're really isolated on the Air Force Base. The Air Force Base is located up in the northern end of the island, and you really have no reason to go outside the gate other than to maybe go down to Micronesia Mall and look at the balls in the machine that everybody enjoys watching.
You know, General Remington, do I still call you Chamorro? No?
That's good, Jeff.
What is the real strategic significance now of Guam in the Pacific? I mean, obviously there's a growing military presence. Part of that is because we get kicked out of other places. But why is Guam so important to the U.S. military?
To have a presence that's not too far away from those that would do harm to America, whether it be North Korea, China, et cetera. We've had a continuous bomber presence in Guam since as long as I can remember, probably 1990s, I think is about the time, mid-90s, we put continuous bomber presence, whether it be B-52s or B-1s or B-2s in Guam. And today, it's very, very important to use it as a deterrent to North Korea.
Esther, you were talking a little bit. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to add to that. In fact, the bombers did come back in the late 90s for the permanent presence. But I think Guam gained a lot of importance when we left the Philippines. You know, before we had the big presence in the Philippines at the Navy base at Subic and Clark, there was a lot of thought about going away from Guam, about basically shutting down Guam. And so we actually had a series of close downs in Guam where we shut down the Naval Air Station, which was located with the airport, and then they also closed a part of Anderson, a big housing area. And so some of that area was turned back over to the government of Guam. But then when we closed the Philippines, it really sort of made a much more important.
Craig Santos Perez, what's the economy like in terms of the military is obviously a big piece of it, but what else is going on in the economy there in Guam that's important?
Well, in addition to the military, tourism is the other major industry. It's a huge destination for Japanese tourists, especially.
That's growing, right?
And it's growing. More tourists from Russia and South Korea are also coming to Guam. Many people work for the government of Guam as well. It's a very large employer. Unfortunately, because of the lack of economic opportunities outside those industries, many Chamorros have been forced to migrate, like other people in Micronesia. So, I include my family in that. There are now more Chamorros who live off-island than on-island, with large populations in California, Washington, Texas, and here in Hawaii.
You mentioned earlier that your family left when you were 15, and then what was the reason? Was it literally an economic migration?
Yes.
Can you explain what happened?
Well, Guam was going through a pretty bad recession in the mid-90s when my parents decided to leave and felt that they could have better economic opportunities in California.
Esther Kia, is that a concern that the economy is too narrowly focused in Guam, or is it more robust than we might think given that description?
Well, if you look at all of the U.S. territories, Guam is actually in a better position than most of the other territories because of the DoD presence on top of the tourism. All of the others are actually more vulnerable to economic downturns in tourism, and of course, in the case of the U.S. Virgin Islands, just natural destruction.
Well, in Puerto Rico now.
Yeah, of course, Puerto Rico. The other, which I talked about earlier with regard to DoD's presence, small business is a major economic driver in Guam's economy, on top of DoD and tourism. And the small business is normally a trigger effect of serving overall society, but a trigger effect of both tourism and DoD. And as I mentioned, that my family, after my dad retired from the Navy as a civilian, he started we went from a mom and pop plant and nursery to the largest landscaping firm on the island, which employed a lot of people. And we serviced all of the industries in Guam. So there is, one can argue that there is not enough diversity, but when you have a small island of 160,000 people, one will conclude that they're faring better than a lot of other areas. And because of its geographical proximity to Asia, because of the duration of flights, that's what gives it a competitive edge over destinations, including Hawaii, because it's a shorter time travel.
Let me ask, Mr. Baker, when you were there, did you get a sense that there was any resentment by the population?
No, really not. The Air Force, of course, is quite small, and the presence was quite small there at the time. And I thought we had a fairly good relationship with the neighboring communities. In fact, at the time, my daughter was going to school, and one of the projects was to actually go out to the communities and interview the leaders of the towns. And so when I asked her a couple of years ago, and I said, "What do you remember about Guam?" And she said, "Well, I actually remember going to Umatuk and interviewing the gentleman who was talking about the statue of Magellan in Umatuk." And so, you know, she actually remembered that. That was a good experience. And it was an opportunity for the families to go out to the towns and talk to the people.
Craig Santos Perez, what is happening now in terms of the response now of, you mentioned we mentioned you're active in demilitarization and other social causes. What's happening on the ground now in terms of resistance or concerns being expressed about the military presence?
Well, for the past 10 years, people have been protesting the proposed military buildup from Okinawa to Guam. And part of it has to do with environmental impacts, but of course also the social and cultural impacts as well. And so there's been consistent resistance against this buildup, you know, for more than a decade. And unfortunately, every step of the way, you know, every community, you know, outreach event or, you know, every testimony that has been critiquing this buildup, it's pretty much disregarded, and it keeps moving forward, and plans are approved. And so there's a growing movement, you know, to question militarization in Guam and whether or not this buildup will actually benefit the people, and to really highlight the harms it will cause, you know, not only to the people but also to the environment.
You know, we have a clip here from a documentary done by PBS previously that talks about some of these resentments toward the military, but approximately 10% of Guam's civilian population are veterans, many who suffer from the lingering trauma of combat.
Welcome to America by the Numbers. I'm Maria Hinojosa. Behind every number, there's a story. And today's numbers tell a dramatic one. 2.6 million Americans have been deployed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11. More than half struggle with physical or mental health problems stemming from their service. As many as 1 in 5 suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. It's known as the tip of the U.S. spear in the Pacific. A tiny island smaller than New York City, with fewer than 200,000 people. Guam is an unincorporated U.S. territory 6,000 miles away.
I have never seen anything like this. An entire series of photographs in the airport dedicated to fallen soldiers.
K57 Vet Talk listeners, we have the Honorable Governor Eddie Bazacabo. Thank you, sir, for coming aboard.
Again, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here, especially as we lead up to the Liberation Day festivities.
Coming here from outside, I don't think people realize how much Guam's community revolves around the service to the country, the family members that have served, the aunts and the uncles and the brothers, and it's just amazing.
Yeah.
The men and women of Guam are U.S. citizens and serve in the American military at a rate that's 3 times higher than the rest of the country. And in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Pacific Islanders have the highest rate per capita of casualties and deaths, the ultimate sacrifice.
We are living in paradise. And all this is just as a result of some folks that have signed up to put on a uniform and sacrificing everything for what we are enjoying today.
I came here to find out why so many of Guam's people have chosen to become warriors for a country half a world away, and some say get too little in return.
According to Guam's Office of Veterans Affairs, at least 1 in 8 adult Guamanians is a veteran, among the highest percentages of all U.S. states and territories. But in 2012, Guam ranked dead last in per capita spending on medical care by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, or the VA. This at a time when many men and women from Guam are returning from war with mental and physical health challenges.
Now we have a question here from a viewer that might give us some context, be interesting to talk to. You know, can you give us some historical reference on the U.S. colonization of Guam and the Philippines? And it sounds like a natural question for Craig Santos Perez. How does the history of Guam, the modern history of Guam, have to do with this high participation level in the military?
Sure. Well, Guam and the Philippines were both, became part of the U.S. after the Spanish-American War of 1898. And, Guam, between 1898 to 1941, was ruled by the U.S. Navy, and the governor was usually the naval commander. And it wasn't the buildup at that point. Guam wasn't as militarized as it was today. Of course, that changed during World War II when Japan invaded the island, occupied it for about 32 months. And after the U.S. reinvaded and reoccupied the island, they kind of realized the importance to militarize the island. And after that period, the post-war period, is when a lot of the land takings occurred, displacing a lot of Chamorros from their land without fair compensation, or sometimes no compensation. After the Organic Act, Chamarros became U.S. citizens and thus eligible for the draft. And so a lot of the first generations of Chamorros in the military were drafted, including my father during the Vietnam War into the Army. Now, of course, we talk about the tradition of service. So after my father's generation, then more Chamorros started enlisting in the military, partly because of what we call the poverty draft, because there weren't any other economic opportunities. And so that was really the best opportunity for Chamorros for upward economic mobility.
Jeff Remington, when you were responsible for a lot of territory, but is there an appreciation for the needs of the local population in issues like this arise? That do you ask yourself sometimes, is our footprint too big, or is there more we can do for the local community?
Well, the United States military, writ large, whether it be Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, has this internal debate about increasing presence in Guam. And I kind of go back to what you said about the fact that we closed bases in the Pacific, the Philippines specifically, and we wanted to keep our presence across the date line. Also, what's going on Okinawa today. I was the wing commander at Kadena when, I lived that, and the Okinawa prefectural government and the government of Japan and the friction that they have. So I can see how we want to help the Japanese, but we don't want to impose upon Guam, but yet you got to have presence in the Pacific, and so where do you go? I mean, you run out of real estate eventually. So I think the imposition is significant. I think I think DOD realizes that to a certain extent. I mean, I remember we were having conversations when I was on the Joint Staff talking about, increasing the sewer capacity, increasing electricity, increasing, rebuilding the road that goes out of Anderson right down the middle of the island, building high schools, et cetera, on the property, and the imposition that's going to create. So there has been and continues to be a lot of discussion about the U.S. military buildup on the island of Guam.
Yes, I want to talk about the land. The DoD has 1/3 of the island. It has historically and continues to be an issue of contention. I am confident that DoD understands it cannot increase its footprint. In the 1990s, when very valuable federal excess lands from the military went into the federal excess property process, U.S. Fish and Wildlife ended up taking the land, and there was a great concern among the people of Guam that needed to stop. So when I was working with Congressman Robert Underwood during that time frame, we were actually trying to provide relief for some of the families after World War II whose lands were taken, and they were part of the refuge. While we were unable to do that because Congress felt that it could set precedent for places across the country, including here in Hawaii, we were able to get enacted into law the Guam Land Return Act. Guam is the only territory or state in the nation at this point moving forward that will be given the first right of refusal for any federal excess lands moving into the future. So that may have not been a perfect fix for the families impacted, but it certainly would help alleviate some of the tension between the people of Guam and the Department of Defense.
You know, one of the reasons that Guam suddenly jumped back on people's radar screen is because it got in the radar screen of North Korea, right? And Carl Baker, how realistic do you think it is that Guam's militarized level is making it a target any more so than any other place in the Pacific for North Korea?
Well, it's more symbolic, I think, given that what the United States has done in response to North Korea is they've flown bombers out of Guam to the Korean Peninsula. And so I think the equivalence there for the North Koreans is that if you can launch bombers against North Korea, then we should be able to launch missiles toward Guam. And so they see it as a tit for tat, if you will. So it's real, but it's also the fact that North Korea understands that if it would do that, if it would attempt to attack Guam, of course the United States would respond as a U.S. territory. So I think it's a serious concern, but it's a serious concern not just for Guam, but for all of the Asian region.
Craig, what was the response of your friends in Guam when they started hearing North Korea talk like that?
A lot of concern and anxiety and worry. And of course, Chamorros, all across the world were worried. My grandmother, who's in her 90s, who's a survivor of the Japanese occupation, she's goes to bingo every day, goes to church, and I don't want her to spend these next couple of years of her life worrying about whether or not Guam is going to be attacked by North Korea. And so that was the first response, I think, worry. And then second was, angry that we're a target, that we're made a target because we're U.S. territory, because of the military presence on island. And so I think it made a lot of the demilitarization activism, as well as conversations about self-determination, independence, even more urgent, because now we see the dangers and the threats that being a U.S. territory is causing our people and our homeland.
How much, and Esther, maybe you want to cue in on this too, is how much did the occupation affect the thinking of Guam in being open to the amount of militarization that took place, the occupation by the Japanese? I mean, that must have been just a traumatic impact on the whole culture of Guam.
It definitely was. And but of course, there wasn't necessarily a choice. It's not like when the U.S. Defeated the Japanese forces, they said, okay, would you like to be a U.S. territory or would you like to be independent? The military came, they took back the land, they reoccupied it, they built up the military. But the memory of that period is very strong, especially for my grandparents' generation. And, the memory of being occupied, of, 10% of the population was killed during this totally violent period. And so that is a memory, but, we're a few generations removed from that. And now I think more and more people are thinking about, instead of being so militarized that never happens again, what if Guam became, an island of peace, and that peace is our shield as opposed to guns?
Jeffrey Regington, I mean, are there realistic alternatives to Guam as a base at this point in the Pacific? I mean, like, would the U.S. even, do you think, ever consider leaving Guam for some other place?
No. I mean, we could withdraw, and we could come back to Hawaii. We could go all the way to California, to the West Coast. But the signal that sends to anybody in the Pacific, not just our enemies, but our allies, Korea, Japan, I no, I don't think that we would ever consider withdrawing, especially from the date line.
But you're saying this is a much bigger thing than just Guam and the U.S. military. This is the whole relationship with the Pacific.
This is forward presence to reassure our allies that America is there. We only have 7 treaty partners, that when the military is going to come. 5 of them are in the Pacific.
Let me throw out this question, either of you or anybody here. Do we really need? I mean, I was saying earlier, I used to grow up, building airplane models, and I built a B-17 and other aircraft and so on. And the technology has gotten. I mean, do we really need a physical presence when we can project ourselves so quickly with the air power and so on? Is it really necessary to have a big physical presence like that beyond the symbolism?
Let me take that one.
Okay.
I would say yes. If you look at the buildup from China, just in the last 20 or 30 years, and compared to where we were in the United States military in the Pacific to where China is today, the U.S. Air Force specifically has not grown at all. Now, we have put F-22s in Hawaii, we put F-22s in Alaska, we still have F-15s at Okinawa, we have F-16s and A-10s on the Korean Peninsula. We haven't changed the numbers at all. But the buildup from China is huge compared to that. I mean, they outnumber us. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's significant. And the symbol that it would, the signal it would send to our allies, specifically South Korea, Japan, Australia, and those that that are friends, not necessarily allies, like Singapore, et cetera, just our physical presence. If we withdrew, I think the message is not a message we want to send to the rest of the world.
Let me throw out this question, and Esther, maybe you could answer this. Why isn't Guam a state, or why doesn't Guam have the same amount of representation as a state of its size would have? I mean, do we maintain it as a territory, or I don't know, what's the
that's a good question, and
because so they don't have any choices to fight back against this presence.
Sure. It's probably one of the hottest topics right now, not only because of the issue of self-determination in and of itself, but also because of the concerns by the government of Guam that a lot of federal laws and regulations and their one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work in the island of Guam, as is evidenced by the immigration challenges they're having to even bring in workers for the buildup or for their hospitals. So the issue of self-determination is governed by the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution, which gives the right of the people of Guam to become fully independent from the United States, to have free association with the United States, to remain a territory, or to become a state. The practical reality of statehood, however, is that the minimal congressional jurisdiction in the United States is about 500,000 to 600,000 people. So it is unlikely that even if the people voted for voted for statehood, that Congress would provide them that right. Now, I have to say, given all that we were talking about today, and the challenges facing overall economic growth in Guam, not just the presence of DOD, I foresee in the next 10 to 20 years that the people of Guam are going to want to reconsider their underlying relationship with the federal government and determine whether or not it is better off to go on its own.
Let me ask, so that brings me right back to Craig Santos Perez. How active is, I won't call it secession, but I got a couple questions here which we thought we would get. What gives America the right to colonize and occupy the rest of the world, including Guam? Can the U.S. really consider Guam a territory? According to Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of our Constitution, Guam, Hawaii, and other South Pacific lands do not qualify. And a little note, please refer to the people of Guam as Chamarros, which is, again, an identity issue, too. So what would the strategy be for trying to wrestle Guam away from the control of the United States?
Well, this is a conversation that's been going on for several generations, and there's an active decolonization commission on Guam. There's education campaign to think about what a future political status options would be, as well as possible plebiscite in the future for Chamorros to vote on whether they prefer statehood or independence or free association or some other kind of status. And so these conversations are happening right now, and they're important conversations. And they're all related to militarization as well, because the fact that DOD because Guam is such an important site that it makes decolonization even more difficult, because then it would give the Chamorro people more power to determine our future and whether or not we want the military presence on our island.
Is that a very similar debate to what's going on with Hawaiians in the United States?
I think so.
Okay, we have another clip that we can go to now. We talked about the occupation by Japan and how it might have inspired Guam's high enlistment rates for the Korean and Vietnam Wars. But the question that this clip asks is, what's the motivation today?
Last decade, when the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were at their peak, 4 of the U.S. Army's top recruiters were from Guam. Enlistment in the Pacific Islands doubled, while it was plummeting nearly everywhere else in the U.S. Sergeant Gonzalo Fernandez was a top producer for the National Guard, winning Recruiter of the Year 3 times in a row.
In every village on Guam, you're going to find a big amount of people who served in the military. It's a family tradition to do it.
So that must mean that your job is a lot easier than in other places.
The success I have here, I probably couldn't duplicate anywhere else, because I'm not sure that the people of those places are as patriotic as the people on this island.
Michael Bivacqua, a history professor at the University of Guam, thinks the numbers tell a different story.
A lot of it has to do with the shininess and the niceness of the military.
Guam's poverty level is about 50% higher than the national average. Unemployment is almost double. That's in stark contrast to the well-resourced U.S. military, which occupies almost 30% of the island.
Guam is one of the most militarized places in the world, and it seems like there's this excess of resources. And so for me, that's why a lot of them join, because they see it as this clean, green place that offers all these economic possibilities and opportunity.
Carl Baker, what do you think? What do you think is the main motivation that continues to have these high levels of sign-up?
Well, I think, like the clip said, there's an attractiveness, because you're on a small island and you see the military as a way to see the world. It's an opportunity for economic advancement. You have a lot of veterans that live in Guam, and you see them, they come back home successful with a good retirement check. And so I think that there's a lot of economic motivation for kids to join the military from Guam.
What do you think about that?
I kind of agree with you. I'm not an expert on Guam, most certainly, but I would imagine that there is an economic decision that somebody's making, that the people are making, to advance themselves and their families by joining the United States military. And, my hat's off to them. I applaud their efforts, and I applaud their service to the country.
Craig, your own thoughts about it?
Well, just to add, I think when we talk about militarism, it creates this kind of exploitative situation where we see the land as nothing more than a military base. And then we see the bodies of the native people as nothing more than possible soldiers. And even though, Chamorros have agency to decide, to make these decisions, and oftentimes it is a kind of narrow economic decision, we have to also highlight this kind of exploitative situation that has put, kind of limited the choices that Chamorros have in terms of, their livelihood or economic opportunities.
Esther, what do you think about that? And also, what do you think is the next step for this development, in terms of the relationship between Guam's people and the military, and even Guam, the growth of Guam's people as a people?
Well, first, let me deal with the question that you just asked everyone. I think it's also a legacy issue, because you have had so many people who are in the military, their sons and daughters and grandchildren want to be part of that legacy. Former General Ben Blas, who became the delegate to the United States from Guam, is a perfect example. He ended up leading the U.S. Marine Corps division that was responsible for landing on Guam during the occupation, talking about a circle coming around. So part of the challenge, I think, for the future of Guam is that you have all of these multitude of factors going into the future of what people think about DOD. I believe it's going to be rocky. I think while we've been talking mostly about DOD, we got to look at the totality of the U.S. territorial relationship, and it's not a good one. Because Guam is not a state, it is not so much that it doesn't have a delegate that can vote on the House floor, it is the absence of 2 U.S. senators. As long as you do not have political leverage, you will always be treated inequitably by the federal government. A perfect example, GDP statistics for all of the states automatic. They don't have to pay for it, right? The Bureau of Economic Analysis at the U.S. Department of Commerce provides it. Not for the territories or not for Guam. The Office of Insular Affairs, which I oversaw, provides $750,000 to BEA to provide this data. Is that equity? I could talk about tens and tens of unfair practices by the U.S. government. Again, going back to immigration and workforce development on the island of Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands will be shaking things up for the future of the federal territorial relationship. If the U.S. government does not look at the uniqueness of their economic challenges, I'm afraid that it's not going to bode well for the federal government in general or DOD. Most recently, Guam Governor Calvo expressed concerns about the failure of Homeland Security and DOD to provide relief for the denial of H-2B visas for the military buildup. And he is expressing that he does not want to participate in the buildup anymore.
So there's not even enough jobs. There are not even enough people there to fill the jobs.
For not just military construction, but overall society. And as a result, it's not, I think the governor of Guam is saying, it's not just about the military buildup. Our economy and our people are suffering. And the United States, what are you going to do about it? And as a result, it's going to get bumpier moving into the next decade.
That brings us up to just a reminder for our viewers that War for Guam is a documentary that will air next. It characterizes the Chamorro people as victims of U.S. occupation since World War II and their national struggle to seek justice for the return of their land and departure of the military. That's right after this program. Craig Santos Perez, I mean, what is your gravest concern about the immediate future of Guam?
Besides nuclear war,
I've got a viewer question I'm going to go to John Remington on a second.
I'm just concerned about the environmental impacts of militarization. There are more than a dozen Superfund sites on Guam. They've contaminated our land and our waters, our drinking water as well. And a lot of these toxins that my people have been exposed to have, caused us to suffer disproportionately from various types of cancers. So many of my relatives and so many Chamorros have died from cancer, and it's, that's true for most militarized places as well. And so I'm worried about that slow violence that's been going on in Guam because of militarization for decades, as well as the immediate threat of war with, the current president, the rising tensions in the Asia-Pacific region.
So caller asks, what do you believe is the real likelihood of North Korea bombing Guam?
Well, they're not going to bomb Guam. They might shoot a missile at it.
Okay, well, semantics. I don't think they do care.
Look, Kim Jong-un has not perfected an intercontinental ballistic missile. He has shot a lot of intermediate range ballistic missiles, and Guam can be ranged by an intermediate range ballistic missile. He hasn't put a nuclear weapon on top of anything yet. I believe that he will, and I believe that he will demonstrate the capability in the Pacific somewhere, not over Guam. And he'll detonate a nuke in the atmosphere at 100,000 feet or whatever, and he'll say he has the capability. It's easy it's easy to threaten, and Guam was easy because it's in the range of an intermediate range ballistic missile. I don't think he'll threaten Guam when he demonstrates the capability with an intercontinental ballistic missile, which is a much harder problem to intercept, which is a much, lots of math, lots of.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but on that point, I've heard it said, because we've had this conversation about Hawaii, that the true capability of the U.S. military to deal with incoming missiles or launched missiles is secret. That there's way more capability to deal with it than the military is willing to let on, and that we really shouldn't worry much about this, and not just because of mutually assured destruction, but because, they know how to take one of these things out.
I don't believe it's secret.
But do they have the capability of protecting Guam?
Well, that's why we put THAAD on Guam, was to protect Guam from the intermediate range ballistic missile. THAAD is not very good against a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile. It is very good against an intermediate-range ballistic missile. That's why THAAD is on Guam.
Is that the same system that protects Israel?
No.
Is it similar?
Israel has what they call Iron Dome, and
Right,
I'm not very familiar with what it's made up of. But Israel has a little bit of a different problem. Intermediate range ballistic missiles and short range missiles. That's why they have PAC-3 there. It's not PAC-3, it's like that, which is a short range ballistic missile. They're short, intermediate, and then intercontinental. And the Iron Dome thing is a little bit different.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to divert you. So do you think they should worry or not?
Yes, we should always worry. I mean, the bluster that happens between the two leaders, it creates tension.
Your own feeling?
Yeah, it's sure you have to worry, but in fact, in many ways, Guam is better protected, as Jeff is suggesting, is better protected than Hawaii right now, because it is an intercontinental range missile that gets to Hawaii. It's an intermediate range missile that gets to Guam, and the THAAD is there. They have PAC-3. There's Aegis cruisers in the Pacific that can actually help protect Guam as well. So in many ways, Guam is better off today than Hawaii is, simply because the defense against intercontinental missiles isn't as effective as intermediate.
Esther, I know you were in the Obama administration. How distressed are you about at least the levels of rhetoric going on, and do you feel a little bit afraid for the world, given what's going on between the U.S. and North Korea right now?
I think I'm more disappointed than afraid. Again, even with the concerns by many in Guam about the presence of DOD, the fact of the matter is, whether it was had a DOD presence or not, it was a U.S. territory, so it would have been vulnerable to begin with. The fact that it is better prepared than most U.S. jurisdictions in the area toward attack, I think, would allay people's concerns. But I continue to be disappointed with the actions of both presidents. And they're fueling the flames for something that is unnecessary.
Okay, now we have one more piece of video from this documentary we've been showing, and we've talked about how Guam citizens from Guam have overachieved in respect to their willingness to go to war for the United States. But has the U.S. Congress reciprocated with support for these veterans, and even indeed the whole territory, whose home has almost no political representation or leverage?
Do you wish that there was a veterans hospital on the island of Guam?
No. The number of veterans that we hospitalized, truthfully, quite small in numbers.
Because there were no official VA representatives in Guam to answer our questions, the VA flew in Craig Oswald from Hawaii to meet with me. He took me on a tour of the new outpatient clinic opened in 2011.
So what we're seeing along the first part of the corridor are some of the physicians' offices.
So psychiatry?
That's correct. We've got a board-certified full-time psychiatrist, 2 of them here on island.
Is that enough?
To treat veterans.
You feel like having 2 psychiatrists on the island to treat veterans Is that enough? Do you wish there was more?
I think right now we're doing well because we have some additional mental health staff that we've added to the clinic, namely social workers and nurses.
I pressed him on what I'd been hearing from veterans about a lack of services, and specifically what Roland said about the treatment he needs for his PTSD. So everything seems to look great. I mean, great facility, but the stories that we're hearing from this particular veteran don't jive with...
Right, it doesn't line up with what one would expect.
Yeah, with what you're saying, frankly.
It doesn't line up with what I would expect either. We do have some specialized types of PTSD care available in Honolulu.
But he says, I'm from Guam. This is my home.
Right.
I'm an American citizen. I deserve to get the treatment that I need here on Guam.
Right, and we agree,
So where's the snafu? Is it that the federal government in Washington just doesn't see these veterans? Guam's so far away?
No, I don't think so. No, I think Guam is very well known, to big VA, to Washington, D.C. And so our particular healthcare system has actually received several million dollars that's being spent directly on veterans in the Pacific.
Right now, we're just...
But the highest elected official on the island, Governor Eddie Calvo, said that the Senate cut mental health care funds for Guam 2 years in a row.
And I advised them, I said, folks, these are statistics of all our veteran population, some of the statistics on the suicides that we've had, but since we don't have a vote in the Senate, that would mean that they would have to have the heart of Mother Teresa because it does not affect their home state.
Is the United States right now living up to its commitment to Guam in terms of what it's doing for the veterans?
The federal government has not done their part to assist a very patriotic group of American citizens fighting in so many distant lands, in areas that have never tasted democracy. Yet, these American citizens of Guam really have not felt what true democracy is all about.
Craig Santos Perez, do you feel like the people of Guam feel like they're just ignored by the U.S. government, just used?
I think many people feel used, exploited, dispossessed, disempowered. And that's an emotional clip for me to watch. As I mentioned, my father's a veteran, and my uncles and cousins, relatives. And, I've seen them suffer and, come back from service, with PTSD or other physical injuries. And, this is a major problem. And in the short term, there needs to be more funding, absolutely, to support veterans. And, there needs to be more, I think, political power in terms of representation. But ultimately, what underlines all these problems is Guam's colonial status as a territory. And so we also need to have a conversation about, possibilities of independence and more control over, our homeland and our future.
Esther Kiaina, do you feel like there's some, what do you feel is the political, first, describe what Guam has in terms of representation and where that's lacking.
Sure. Guam has a delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives, Madeline Berdalio, who is able to vote in committees and subcommittees, but unable to vote on the House floor. They don't have 2 U.S. senators. That's only available through statehood. And as a result, when you combine those 2 elements, there is no leverage on the part of Guam or any of the territories to be fully represented in the federal discourse. Having said that, most of the delegates have been on the House Armed Services Committee historically, and that's where a lot of the action is done. So they have been successful to scare a lot of issues, including non-DOD related issues in the National Defense Authorization Act. But going back to self-determination, I just think that it is a opportune time for also the United States, not just the people of Guam, to advance that issue so that we could fulfill our mandate under the United Nations. They are on the list of non-self-governing territories. So we not only have a legal obligation to help the people of Guam, we have a moral obligation.
This extends to more than just Veterans Affairs. It extends to other sorts of federal impacts. The caller was a former teacher on Guam when schools were integrated between locals and military families. Once the military built their own schools, funding was withdrawn from public schools. And what's the situation today? Let me start with Carl Baker. You were telling me about what happened. What happened back then? The military just decided they had to build their own schools, or what happened?
Well, it was an evaluation, I think, by DOD that the school systems in Guam weren't good enough, that they weren't getting good enough scores from the kids. The kids were not doing well after they left Guam. They would leave Guam and be behind because of the poor quality of the education. That was the argument, and so then they said, well, the only way we can fix this is to bring in the DOD system. So when you do that, you bring in outside management, you bring in a whole new set of teachers. And
physically different school buildings.
Build your own schools, and the schools, the elementary schools anyway, were located on the base.
What was the impact, Craig Santos Perez? What was the impact of that?
Well, I think it created, a segregated system where, the schools within the base, had so much more resources, and, the teachers had better pay, of course, and it created, I think, you could kind of see the inequality between, military personnel and the civilian population. And so that continues to be a problem. And as Dr. Bivacqua in one of the earlier clips pointed out, that creates another way to try to convince Chamorros to enlist in the military. Because you look at all the services that are in the base, the only way, if you want access to that, you're going to have to enlist. And so, it kind of fuels the predatory recruitment that much of the military recruiters use on island.
Jeffrey Remington, what is the obligation, or is there a sense that if a military place, a place where a military has a presence like this, and there's other places like that, what is the motivation for the military presence to do more for the social support, the educational support, or other kinds of support for the local community? What's the motivation for them to do that? Is there motivation for them to do that?
Absolutely.
And then what do they do?
Well, I'll take Hawaii as an example. Hawaii, and I will say this being a citizen of Hawaii now, had and still has to some extent a bad reputation for their public schools. I will tell you that I had two daughters that went to Radford. One graduated from Radford. And I was very, very happy with Radford. The U.S. military provides funding to the public school system based on the number of kids, military kids, that are going to those schools. And I think the integration has worked well. I don't know the history. I don't know why Guam did what they did and DOD did what they did in Guam, but it would seem to me that, there's opportunity here. I mean, why can't we help the school system on Guam by integrating it again? I mean, maybe there was a right to, maybe it was the right thing then. But if we're going to build this presence out there, perhaps there's an opportunity there, especially for the local folks.
Mr. Keanu, what other things could be done along? That sounds like a constructive suggestion.
Well, I think what has to happen is the Trump administration, mostly the DOD political leadership, will have to determine what kind of approach it wants to take toward Guam. Deputy Secretary Bob Work, who was under President Obama and then also the first several months under Trump, he implemented in concert with the governor of Guam a four-pillar approach. And one of the four pillars included the One Guam approach, which was to project out the challenges that the DOD is having with Guam and move it toward a future. So I think what needs to happen, first of all, that approach should continue, but it needs to be clearly articulated by the political appointees at DOD.
Let me ask Craig Santos Perez. I'll give you the last word here. We've only got about 30 more seconds. I mean, how hopeful are you after this conversation that there is an interest in reaching out or at least supporting the people, the Chamorro people?
I think a lot of that is rhetoric, and ultimately DOD is going to use the island for what they've always used the island for, and that's for militarization. What gives me hope is the Chamorro people on Guam standing up for our indigenous rights, our rights to self-determination and sovereignty, as well as Chamorros standing up to protect our environment and our culture.
I have to stop on that point. Thank you all very much, and thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. And we thank our guests, Carl Baker from the Pacific Forum Center for Strategic and International Studies, Esther Kia-Aina from Pacific Basin Development Corporation, and Dr. Craig Santos Perez from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and retired Air Force Lieutenant General Jeffrey Remington. Next week on Insights, the Trump administration's budget calls for a $54 billion increase in military spending, which may come from deep cuts in domestic programs. We'll meet with members of Hawaii's nonprofit community to see how they are preparing for less federal support. But right now, stay tuned for PBS Hawaii Presents and the documentary War for Guam. I'm Daryl Huff for Insights on PBS Hawaii. A hui hou.